Hi, my name is Guy Evans. I'm standing in an orchard on the banks of Lake Chelan in north-central Washington state. The grandparents of the trees in this orchard were planted by my great-grandfather over 70 years ago. His name was Raymond O'Neill. Ray and his wife Annie had tried to farm 2 different acreages before coming to this land. The first on the Chelan Butte proved to be too steep, with unfavorable living and farming conditions. The second, near lake level, was more profitable, but was soon scheduled to be permanently inundated with water upon the completion of the Chelan Dam. So, in 1927, at the ages of 45 and 35, Ray and Annie decided to try again for a 3rd time. They bought this land, cleared the sagebrush, planted apple and apricot trees, built a small house, and with their family moved on to the ranch. My grandfather and later my father continued the orcharding tradition, so as a young boy I grew up around trees like these. I also grew up around the sounds and smells of diesel tractors, and at home the comforts of electric heat and hot showers, modern conveniences my great-grandfather never enjoyed. In this video we will explore what life was like on the ranch for Ray, Annie, and their 5 children. Theirs is a story of determination, persistence, and resourcefulness. And like many Americans at the time, theirs is also a story of ignorance, of the long and arduous years that lay ahead. Years that would later come to be known in American history as the Great Depression.
He would come in and she would get so embarrassed. He'd go by her and pinch her. And she'd slap his hands and say, "Quit that! Stop that!" I'm sure that the rest of the kids noticed it too, because I certainly noticed that. I'd see him do that, and she would just get so flustered and she'd say, "Stop that!"
He was probably the most honest person in his word. When he said, "I'll be there at 7 o'clock," he was always there.
One thing that I always remember him saying was that you have to shoot when the geese are going by, and by that he meant when an opportunity came along, like to get somebody to help you do something, you better do it. And I guess he did say another one when we were working with the horses. He would say, "Boy, it's all right for you and I to know they're stuck," he said, "but don't let them know it."
Life was simple on the ranch. Ray and Annie lived as they had on the butte, raising nearly all of their own food. Meat came from pigs, chickens, and a calf, vegetables from the garden, and milk, butter, and cream from the Jersey cow. The fruit trees needed several growing seasons before they would begin to produce. To earn money during this time, Ray grew watermelons in the orchard rows between the small trees. Everyone in the family helped tend and sell the watermelons, especially Ray and Annie's 2 oldest daughters, Betty and Peggy.
And when the plants would be little and just barely up, he would take a hoe and make a ditch around each plant. And we saved all the cow manure, and he'd mix water with it in a pail. And I would have to go along with that pail full of manure. We called it manure tea. And I would take a dipper of that stuff and put it in each one of these holes, and then he would cover it over, which was good fertilizer for each individual plant. Daddy had a fruit stand he built out right on the road. It's where the mailboxes are now. And Betty and I would sit out there from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till whatever it was, probably 8 or 9 o'clock at night. and sell watermelon for people coming by. And Daddy had weighed each one and put a price on them. He scratched it on with a nail so that you knew exactly how much they were. One Sunday, I remember, we sold $40 worth. And you take a watermelon that would sell maybe 35, 25, 10, 15 cents, 25 cents, 35 cents. $40 was quite a bit. And Betty and I got 10 cents on the dollar. So that day, with the $40, Betty and I each got $4.
In the late 20s, when the O'Neills moved to the ranch, the first tractors began to appear in the Chelan Valley. This marked the beginning of a slow but steady transition from horsepower to gas and diesel power in the orchards. But it would be over a decade before Ray would be able to afford one of the new machines himself. Through the 20s and 30s, Ray continued to use his horses for pulling plows, cultivators, sprayers, and other loads on the ranch.
He was very protective of his horses. He didn't want them to get hurt, and he didn't want them doing something that he was pretty sure they couldn't do. For instance, some kind of a load to pull. And in all of my lifetime, he never, ever lent out his horses. Never. Now, he would send me sometimes to go with the horses, and he would always inform the man that my boy here will handle the horses. You just leave the lines alone, and he will handle the horses. But he did tell me one day when I went down to haul some apples out for Mr. Paul Harper, he said, "Now you'll have to watch it down there today, boy, because if you don't, Mr. Harper will have those horses stopped every 5 feet," he says, because he thinks they're tired, you know. So, and I remember Mr. Harper saying quite often that, "I think we better stop and let them rest a little, don't you?" And I said, "I think they better go a little further yet." So we'd go a little further and then we'd stop. They were not big horses like you would use over in the wheat fields, you know, where they were pulling big plows and big things like that. His horses probably weighed 1,350 to 1,400 pounds. That's all, and that's a small horse.
And like I said, when he worked in the orchards, he'd usually never use the lines. He'd lay them on something, and the old mare did all of because she knew what to do, and once in a while she'd need a little help, and he'd give her a gee or a haw, and she knew what.
He always made sure that his animals had plenty to eat and time to eat them. But at the same time, he watched them, and if they were not cleaning up all the feed you put in the manger for them, he would have you cut it down a little. Not too much, but just cut it down a little bit to where they were eating, as he said, cleaning up all their food. He wanted them to eat the whole thing. He didn't want it wasted, because we had to buy our hay. We couldn't raise much on the ranch here, and it costs a lot of money.
Money became more scarce on the ranch towards the end of 1929. Up to this point, the family had been living on money earned each summer from the fruit stand and on the earnings Ray made by hiring out with his team of horses to dig foundations, plow gardens, and haul loads in the community. But on October 29, 1929, following days of erratic trading, the New York stock market crashed. Nationwide, investors lost millions, banks collapsed, and public confidence in the economy was shattered. Within a matter of months, the country plunged into the Great Depression, shrinking the small stream of money the O'Neills depended on to a trickle.
We always had enough to eat. And as your great-grandpa would say, you don't have to eat it, but that's all there is. And sometimes it was just maybe potatoes, and of course your great-grandma canned a lot, so you know, there could be beans or peas or, you know, things like that. And there was always bread and there was always jam. Yes, I knew things were tough, I could tell you that, because there wasn't any money to go to show. You know, other kids were going to the show, but there wasn't any money for that. And Guy, I don't think I ever had a brand new pair of trousers that were my own, bought brand new out of the store, till I was probably at least 14 years old, or maybe 13, because your Uncle Joe was growing so fast that even though he didn't wear his clothes out, he grew out of them, and your grandmother would cut them down to fit me. So, you know, that told me something. There was certainly nothing the matter with them. I mean, they were good clothes, and we certainly were not the only family that was doing that. You know, it was, it really was tough.
I didn't have money to go to the high school things, so the teachers would arrange it so I would sell tickets at the football games or basketball games, or I would, if we had they always put on plays at high school, then I would be an usher and would be able to take people to their seats and everything. So I was able to get around, but I don't ever remember having a store-bought dress until I was probably a senior in high school. My mother made all my clothes, made all my dresses. Back in those days, nobody wore slacks or jeans, or they were unheard of, but we wore dresses.
As the Depression set in the early 1930s, the apricot trees that Ray had planted entered full production. But the harvests Ray had envisioned selling for a profit brought in only meager earnings. One year the price was so low, Ray left the entire crop of apricots to hang and rot on the trees. In the midst of these challenges, in the spring of 1932, Annie discovered she was pregnant. On November 6th of that year, Ray and Annie's fifth child, Catherine Ann O'Neill, was born. That winter, both Ray and Annie worked in the apple packing plants to earn money for groceries. The older kids, already well trained in the daily chores of the ranch, took on many of Annie and Ray's responsibilities at home.
Mom never made a menu up, never. But we had potatoes and onions and lots of milk. And so every night when they would come home for dinner, I would have dinner ready, and I made potato soup every night. And the fifth night, Mom came home and it was potato soup. She blew her top. She said, "I am not eating any more of this, and don't you ever cook it again." And Daddy said, "Well, I don't see what's wrong with it." He said, "The pest and I both like it, and it tastes good." And Mom said, "We'll not have it again." And I said, "Well, then you make the menu out and you tell me what to cook." I said, "I never can find anything in the house to cook." I was not a cook anyway. I was not imaginative to figure out what to cook. I didn't care about cooking. We always had a Jersey cow, so we had lots of rich cream. In fact, the Jersey cow cream was so thick, in order to whip it, you had to put milk in it. The cream was too thick to do anything with.
Then you had the pigs to take care after you milked the cows and separated. And we used brand. I forgot what kind it was, but you mixed it with water, and then you took the skim milk and put into it. And they thought that was pretty good. And in the fall, we butchered them, and I always hated to scrape them, but I did. Used a knife. You never cut the skin, you just took the hair off. And we had a 50-gallon drum at the end of the table, and you would dip them down into that steaming hot water, and you'd pull them out and you'd strip hair as fast as you could, and if you didn't get all of it, well, you did it over again.
Dad would put the hams and the bacons down in this box, and he would rub what we call Morton salt on it. And then he'd lay that in there and cover it up and put the lid back on the box. And I don't recall us opening that in the wintertime. I'm not quite sure. But anyhow, during times in the winter, he would say, you can come down in the basement and help me with the meat. So I'd go down and we'd have rags dipped in vinegar, and we'd rub it on the hams and bacon. That would get the mold off. Then we would put some more Morton salt back on it, and then we'd put it back in. And as I recall, the meat box was always open when Dad started the heavy work in the spring. Dad always had what I call the straw pit, you know, that he put vegetables in the fall and put straw down in the dirt, put the vegetables in, then covered them up with straw, then put dirt over them, deep enough so it wouldn't freeze, you know. I could always hear him sometime late February or March, he'd say to your great-grandma, don't you think it's time to open up the straw pit? And she'd say, well, I have a few more of this and that, let's use them up first, and then we'll open up the straw pit, you know. Even though the carrots you had in the basin might be wrinkled, you know, you didn't throw them away. Maybe the potatoes had a few bad spots in them, but you cut those out and used them, and they were perfectly good, you know. But I remember that. I can still see that pit. Mm-hmm.
Was it a big deal when it was opened up?
Oh yes, because you know that was just like having fresh vegetables right out of the store, you know, which we didn't buy because we didn't have any money, like our neighbors. Or if we did have, we didn't have any for fresh vegetables, you know. It was for more things like staples, like sugar and flour and salt and things like that.
My mom made bread twice a week, and I hated those homemade bread sandwiches when I'd go to school. I looked at those kids with their store-bought bread, and I'd think, oh, I wished I could just eat that. And it got so after a while, the kids found out about that homemade bread, and they would argue over who got to trade sandwiches with me at lunchtime. So I got the store-bought bread, and they ate the homemade bread, and they thought it was wonderful.
They canned everything, Guy, you could think of that we like to eat. If they didn't like it, they didn't can it. But gosh, she canned apricots, peaches, pears, some cherries, not too many cherries, no. All kinds of jams and preserves and pickles and things like that. I remember she used to make pickled peaches, and boy, they were good. Yeah, they really were good. And they had a little, each one had a little piece of clove stuck in it, you know. It was a little round thing, kind of like a thumbtack, only it didn't have as big a head. I remember that, yeah. You always had to get that out before you ate it, but that wasn't much of a problem.
And she put up quite a bit of, like, tomatoes and that kind of stuff. And then she made several kinds of pickles, watermelon pickles. And back in those days, you know, the rind was thicker than it is today. It wasn't anything to get 3/4 of an inch of rind on a watermelon.
Canning, cooking, baking bread, and heating the house all depended on the cook stove in the kitchen. The family burned over 10 cord of firewood each year, keeping the stove hot. Firewood was harvested from Cooper Mountain with the help of Mr. Halleck, the neighbor man, and his truck. Cooper Mountain had burned in 1929, and the Forest Service permitted individuals to salvage the burned timber. Ray paid 50 cents for the entire year's 10-cord supply. The cook stove was also used to heat water for bathing. Every Saturday, the wash tub was pulled into the kitchen and filled with hot water from the stove.
We would get our bath first in the bathtub, and then the boys got theirs in the same water. Everybody used the same water. It was too hard to heat it, and it was too hard to get rid of it. So they only had to dump the tub once. In the wintertime, it was cold in the house, and you put the wash tub right in front of the kitchen stove so you could keep warm taking your bath. And I remember one time it was so cold, and I bent over to dry, and my bottom, there was a metal bar across the stove, part of the trim. And when I bent over, that metal bar went right across my bottom, and I couldn't sit down for a long time. Boy, that was hurt. I never forgot it. Daddy would go to town looking like a hayseed. It didn't make any difference to him what he went to town in. He was Ray O'Neill, and it didn't bother him a bit. He went to town with whatever he had on it. That was it. Mom would never think of going anyplace unless she was spiffy and just right. Like when she belonged to Eastern Star, she wore long dresses and had her hair done and looked very nice all the time. Daddy was different. He smoked, and every once in a while he quit smoking. He'd throw his pipe and his cigarettes away out in the orchard someplace, and then he'd be out trying to find them. He did cultivating around Chelan a lot with his horses. And his voice was loud and carried. And he did the city park, which now is in Chelan there, the city park where the trees are and the swimming hole and all that stuff. And he would be down there cultivating those trees, and he would be yelling at his horses. And the day the wind blew, you could hear every word he said. Some days it embarrassed Mom.
When your grandmother, O'Neill, great-grandmother, would get a little disgusted or something, you know, about something, she'd say, "Oh, fiddlesticks." That's about all she ever said was, "Oh, fiddlesticks." I remember her saying that, but of course your great-grandmother O'Neill was a very staunch Methodist. She did not sew on Sunday. She always said your stitches will come out.
Brownie was a brown water spaniel and had curly hair, and we just loved him. When we were kids and we had these watermelon patches, we could have watermelon anytime we wanted it. So we'd go out in the patch and pick out one that we wanted, cut it in half, and eat the heart out of it. That's all. And if it tasted good, we might eat the rest of it. And you know, that brownie was the same way we were. We'd cut a watermelon for him and he'd eat the heart out of it, but he didn't eat the rest of it. He got spoiled just the same as we did. I don't know how long we had him, but I think he eventually got cancer. And he was always digging up Mom's flower beds to get cool in the summertime. He was looking for coolness. And he was sick. He was sick, which was too bad because, you know, we all loved that dog. And when Daddy took him, he had to be destroyed, but because he was in misery. But Daddy should have never taken him where he did. Across from where we lived, up on that hill toward Noseum, was a pine tree. And Daddy took him up there by that pine tree and shot him. And Toad was standing out in the, I can still see Toad, little boy that he was halfway between the house and the barn. And he threw himself on the ground and was crying because that happened.
I remember my dad took him across the road up a canyon there and shot him. And that was the end of Brownie. And I remember going over there later on that afternoon and piling a lot of rocks on him and over him so the coyotes couldn't bother him, you know, because Grandpa just, he hadn't buried him or anything. So I kind of buried him, put him under a rock tomb, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the first dog I remember is Brownie.
The barn was not very high, and at the end of the barn, he had stocked up a bunch of corn fodder that was stacked and was going to be put in the barn later on for the cows for the winter time. And Joe and I got, I don't know how many other kids we got up there with us, so we'd climb up on top of the barn, run across it and jump in those corn fodder tops. And I don't remember what happened to Joe, but I remember what happened to me because I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes Sunday morning, and all of a sudden my dad came in with a stick or something and started whipping me standing right there at the kitchen sink. And we didn't have lights up in the ceiling. They hung on a long cord, and then the light globe was at the bottom of that. And when his hand went back to put the stick, he hit that globe. And that stopped him. He quit after that. But he said, how do you think those cows are going to feel eating food that's been jumped in like that and squashed and all beat to pieces? And he said, you don't want your food all beat to pieces, but we never did it again.
I guess probably what they taught us the most was between right and wrong, and two wrongs does not make a right. You treat people like you'd like to be treated. If you want to be talked to nice, you talk to people nice. If once in a while you want somebody to lend you a hand, once in a while you lend a hand to somebody that's, you know, for instance, somebody that's trying to get something in the back of a pickup and it's too heavy for him, maybe you go over and give him a hand. He appreciates that. And that's the way they were. You lend a helping hand when you could, and you treated people like you like to be treated. So I'd say that probably would cover it all, even today.
I don't know about the boys, if my dad ever talked to the boys in relation to sex or going out with girls or anything, but boy, Betty and I were never told anything, nothing. because that was secret and you were not supposed to be taught it. And I remember in high school, they would have a girls' class, just in the auditorium. They would keep all the girls in this room. I don't know where the boys in the high school went, but they probably went to the gym. But the girls were in the auditorium, and they would get Eva Anderson would come up from Wenatchee, and she would talk, girl talk, to all the girls in the school. And she was the one that told us things that we should have learned long before that. But all that stuff was hush hush, you know. Don't talk. Don't. But once in a while, somebody would give my mother. There was a magazine called True Story, and it was people who had written up their stories, and they weren't nice stories as a rule. But somebody would give her that magazine, loan it to her, and she'd hide it. And when she wasn't around, I'd find it and I'd read it. I got part of my education by reading True Story magazine.
By the mid-30s, money began to slowly flow again in the economy, and the markets for apricots and apples gradually improved. The apple trees were well on their way to full production and demanded more hands than just the families to pick the fruit at harvest time. Ray found the additional help he needed at the homeless camp set up near the Chelan River on the edge of town.
And these people were bankers and you name it. They were a lot of well-educated people that when the Depression hit, they just got wiped out. And he'd walk through the camp and look them over, and he'd pick out what he wanted, and he'd take them back home and take them down to the beach, and they usually had tents, or he would get one, and they would live down on the beach in there where the houses are now. And then if they didn't have any money, he'd give money to carry them till he started picking, and he never lost a penny.
I remember one day he went to town and he signed up the apricots on a contract for $125 a ton. And he came home, and I can still hear him saying it. He said, well, I signed up for $125 a ton. He said, maybe I didn't do right. He said, my neighbor said he's not going to sign up because he thinks he's going to get more. So he's going to wait 2 or 3 days. Well, he waited the 2 or 3 days and the price dropped to $25. So Daddy really made a hauling on that one.
I swamped or hauled 40 tons of apricots out of your great-grandpa O'Neill's orchard on a stone boat with those 2 horses. I lifted every box from the orchard onto the stone box. I lifted every box from the stone boat off and stacked them up down where the truck could pick them up. And I think apricots were heavy, like pears, they're heavy. I think probably 50 boxes would make a ton. And I know it was around 40 tons. And your great-grandfather, he was just as good as his word and the money came in for the apricots. He bought me a bicycle. I would guess in those days it was anywhere from $15 to $18, maybe not that much, I don't know.
I think it was in 1935. It snowed 6 inches, and we still had, I don't know, 40 trees of wine saps to pick. And they held us out of school. And Charlie Anderson was the only one that stayed. All the rest of the pickers quit. Milton Brownfield was hauling the apples at that time. And I can remember as a kid carrying 2 boxes at a time, 3 and 4 rows over to load the truck. So, and we worked, it would be after midnight, I think it was, that particular night. We got all the fruit off, it froze, and we never lost a box that year. They were pretty lucky that way.
Conditions continued to improve on the ranch during the late 30s and into the 40s. The economy was jump-started in 1941 upon the United States' entrance into the Second World War. The long, lean years of the Great Depression were finally a thing of the past. In the spring of 1945, Ray was able to purchase his first tractor and finally retire his faithful horses. And 3 years later, in the fall of 1948, Ray and Annie's youngest son, Toad, and his wife, Jessie, purchased the orchard. After years of nurturing small trees and small children, Ray and Annie could finally rest.
My dad was a hard worker, and so was Mom. When you figured that they were 35 and 45 when they went over to the ranch and starting out brand new with nothing. Bare ground that had to be cleared and planted. A house, there was no house there, of course. They built the house and they moved into it before it was anyways near finished. It was a big job.
Growing up, we had a good life, as tough as things were, you know, we had a good life. Like I said, all the neighbors were in the same boat, and I couldn't appear to believe that they thought they were poor either, because we didn't think we were poor. It was just a way of life, that's all it was. No, it was a good life, Guy. And it's been a good life since, really.